in the morning when Duke slipped his collar for the 4th time that week. Nora didn't even hear him go. One moment, the old German shepherd was curled at the foot of her bed, breathing slow and even, his grey, muzzled face twitching through whatever dogs dream about. And the next moment, he was gone. The back door swung open against the November wind, and the morning light was still nothing but a thin bruise on the horizon. She knew where he'd be. She always knew. By the time she pulled on her coat and followed his tracks through the frost-stiffened grass, she could already see him. A dark silhouette at the top of the hill. Still as stone, sitting in front of the grave marker with his head slightly bowed, like he was praying. Or listening. Or waiting for something only he could hear. Detective Nora Callahan stood at the cemetery gate and watched her father's retired K-9 partner hold vigil over a dead man's grave for the 4th morning in a row. And then Duke did something he had never done before. He started to dig. Not frantically. Not like a dog chasing a scent or burying a bone. Slowly. Deliberately. Like something was being uncovered that had been buried a very, very long time ago. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She didn't call out to him. Something told her not to. Something told her, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her chest like a stone dropping into still water, that whatever Duke was looking for down there in the frozen earth beneath her, father's grave, it was meant for her to find. Before we go any further, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country name in the comments below. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Harwick was the kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance and felt tired up close. Nestled in the low valley between 2 slow-rising hills in central Pennsylvania, it had maybe 9,000 residents, 3 stoplights, 1 diner that smelled permanently of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and a police department that had been running on the same budget since 1987. The streets were clean enough. The lawns were kept. On Sunday mornings, the church bells from St. Catherine's rolled across the rooftops like something out of a photograph. And if you drove through on the highway without stopping, you might think, what a quiet little place. What a peaceful life that must be. But Nora Callahan had grown up here, and she knew the truth about quiet places. Quiet wasn't the same as safe. Quiet just meant the noise was happening somewhere you couldn't see it. The town cemetery sat on a modest rise just east of the center of town, separated from the nearest street by a wrought iron fence and a long row of old oaks whose roots had been slowly buckling the flagstone path for decades. In autumn, the leaves came down in slow copper waves and gathered in drifts along the rows of headstones. In winter, the whole hilltop became a gray and silver thing, silent and ancient, the kind of place that made you instinctively lower your voice. Frank Callahan's grave was in the second-to-last row, near the eastern fence. Sergeant Francis T. Callahan. Beloved father. Faithful servant. The stone was grey granite, simple and clean, because Frank had been a simple and clean kind of man. No frills. No flourishes. Just the name and the date, and carved below them at Nora's quiet insistence, 3 words he never quit. The grave was 8 months old. 8 months since the phone call that had pulled Nora out of a conference in Pittsburgh and sent her driving through the rain for 3 hours with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel. 8 months since the county coroner, Dr. Leonard Marsh, a soft-spoken man who always smelled faintly of chalk, had stood across a steel examination table and told her, in careful, measured language, that her father had suffered a massive cardiac event. Sudden. Painless. Natural causes. That was what the report said. That was what everyone said. Everyone except Duke. Detective Nora Callahan was 34 years old and had her father's eyes, dark brown, steady, and difficult to fool. She joined the Harwick PD at 22, fresh out of a criminal justice program at Penn State. And she'd worked hard enough and quietly enough that by 30, she held one of only 2 detective positions the department offered. It was a title that sounded more impressive than it was. In a town like Harwick, detective work mostly meant insurance fraud, domestic disputes, the occasional car theft. Real cases, the kind that kept you up at night, were rare enough that when one came along, it felt almost jarring, like a bolt of lightning in a pasture. Sudden, bright, impossible to look away from. She was good at the work, patient, methodical. She had a father's gift for listening, for sitting quietly in a room and absorbing details that other people looked straight through. Frank Callahan had been a patrol sergeant for 22 years and a K-9 handler for 11 of them. He and Duke had been a team since Duke was 2 years old, a Belgian-line German shepherd with a broad chest, intelligent amber eyes, and a nose that had, over the years, located 3 missing children, 2 escaped convicts, and more contraband than Nora cared to count. They moved together like one organism. Frank didn't give Duke commands so much as suggestions. Duke didn't obey so much as agree. Their partnership was the kind that people in the department spoke about with something close to reverence. Duke had been retired 18 months before Frank died. His hips had started to go, not uncommon in working shepherds his age, and after a long conversation with the department vet, Frank had made the call himself. He'd brought Duke home, set up a bed for him in the corner of the living room, and that had been that. No ceremony, no drama, just a quiet transition from partner to companion. Nora had driven up from her apartment in town to see them both that weekend, and she remembered sitting on the porch watching Duke follow Frank around the yard with the careful, unhurried devotion of something that had decided where it belonged and saw no reason to reconsider. "He doesn't know he's retired," Frank had told her, smiling into his coffee mug. "Does it matter?" Nora had said. Frank had thought about that for a moment. Guess not. After Frank died, the question of Duke had been simple. There was no one else. Frank had no siblings living. Nora's mother had passed when Nora was 12. Duke came home with Nora to her small 2-bedroom house on Carver Street, and he settled in with the resignation of a dog who had already survived one great change and understood, somewhere deep in his old bones, that more were coming. For the first 2 months, Duke seemed to be grieving. He ate, but without enthusiasm. He slept more than usual. When Nora came home from work, he would lift his head, study her face for a moment, and then lower it again as if she was close enough but not quite the answer to the question he kept asking. And then, 6 weeks after Frank's funeral, he started going to the cemetery. The first time, Nora thought it was a coincidence. She'd taken Duke for an evening walk past the eastern edge of town, and he'd simply pulled her in that direction. Through the cemetery gate, up the flagstone path between the oaks, all the way to the second to last row. He sat down in front of Frank's grave and didn't move for 20 minutes. She let him. She figured it was grief. Dogs grieved. Everyone knew that, but the next morning, she woke up to find the back door open and Duke gone. She found him at the cemetery. Same spot, same posture. The third time, she started paying attention. The fourth time, he started digging. She crossed the cemetery in long strides, the frost crunching under her boots, her breath fogging in the cold air. Duke. He stopped digging and looked up at her. His expression, and yes, dogs had expressions, anyone who told you otherwise had never spent real time with one was not guilty. It was not playful. It was not the look of an animal caught doing something it knew was wrong. It was urgent. That was the only word for it. His amber eyes were bright and focused, his ears forward, his whole body taut with a message she couldn't yet read. He looked at her the way he used to look at Frank before an alert. Not anxious, not aggressive. "Alert, come here, boy," she said softly. "Come on." He didn't come. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds, and then he looked deliberately down at the ground in front of the grave marker, and back up at her. Down, up, down. The fur along the back of his neck was standing up. Nora crouched in front of him and looked at the ground where he'd been digging. The frost had broken in a rough semicircle, maybe 18 inches in diameter, just to the left of the base of the headstone. The earth beneath was dark and damp and disturbed, but Duke hadn't been digging for the grave itself. He'd been digging beside it, just outside the marked plot boundary, in a narrow strip of ground between Frank's grave and the iron fence. She put her hand flat on the disturbed earth, cold, dense, but different. She pressed harder and felt it, a very slight give, as if the ground beneath this particular patch had been compressed and then released at some point in the not-too-distant past, like something had been buried here, recently. Her detective's brain shifted into a gear she hadn't used in a while. She looked at Duke. He was still watching her, perfectly still, waiting. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, show me." She gave him the command, the old one, the one Frank had taught her as a kid when he used to take her out to the training ground on Saturdays. Single word, low register, seek. Duke lowered his nose to the ground, and then he began to work. She didn't dig that morning. Not there. Not without understanding what she was looking for. You didn't start pulling up earth next to a grave in a public cemetery at 6 in the morning without a plan, and Nora Callahan had not made it to detective by acting before she thought. She put Duke's leash back on. He tolerated it with the long-suffering patience of a dog who knew it was temporary, and she walked him home. She fed him. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window with a mug in both hands and stared out at the yard while the sun finished rising, and she thought very carefully about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the distance between those two things might mean. What she knew, Frank Callahan had died of a heart attack. The coroner's report was official and signed. There had been no marks on his body, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anything other than a man whose heart had simply stopped. He had been 61 years old. He'd had elevated blood pressure for years. He carried a few extra pounds around the middle. These things happened to men like Frank, but what she also knew, Frank had been working on something in the months before his death, something he hadn't talked about directly, but something that had made him quieter than usual, more careful with his words. She'd noticed it on her last few visits, the way he'd glance at his phone before answering it. The way he sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence, as if he was editing himself in real time. She'd assumed it was the retirement, the adjustment, the loss of purpose that hit a lot of officers when they came off the job. She'd told herself he'd find his footing. She'd told herself to give him time. She had given him time, and then there was no more time to give. Now, standing in her kitchen with her coffee going cold, she thought about a different possibility. One she'd been very careful not to think about before now, because once you thought it, you couldn't unthink it. What if Frank's heart hadn't simply stopped? What if someone had made it stop? She set down her mug, went to the spare bedroom, opened the closet. On the top shelf, behind a box of old photos and a folded flag from Frank's retirement ceremony, there was a cardboard box she'd brought from her father's house after he died. She'd gone through it once, quickly, looking for insurance documents and the deed to the house. She hadn't looked at it carefully. She hadn't been ready. She was ready now. She lifted the box down and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside, a rubber-banded stack of old utility bills, a folder of medical records, 3 notebooks. Frank's habit, going back decades, was to write everything down longhand in spiral-bound notebooks. A handful of photographs, loose faces she half recognized from department Christmas parties 20 years ago. A small envelope containing his K9 certification medals, Duke's included, and tucked into the back corner of the box. Under everything else, a manila envelope. Unsealed. Thick. Addressed to no one. Nora's hands were very still as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Her father's familiar block letter printing, dense and precise, filling both sides of the page. At the top, underlined twice, "MARSH, CARVELLO the shed." She read the first 3 lines and her throat went dry. She read the whole page. Then she sat for a long time in her kitchen with the paper in her hands and the sound of Duke's slow breathing behind her, and she tried to figure out exactly how much danger she was in. The name CARVELLO, she knew. Victor CARVELLO was the deputy mayor of Harwick, a thick-necked, silver-haired man of about 55 who had been in town government for nearly 20 years, who smiled wide and remembered names, and had an American flag pin on every blazer he owned. He showed up at department fundraisers and shook hands and said things like community partnership and working together and we're all on the same team. He was the kind of politician who was so aggressively normal, so relentlessly unremarkable, that you stopped noticing him after a while. He became part of the background, part of the wallpaper. That, Nora now understood, was possibly deliberate. The name Marsh she knew too. Dr. Leonard Marsh, the county coroner, the man who had ruled her father's death a cardiac event. What she had not known What her father's handwritten notes laid out in careful, numbered detail was that Victor CARVELLO and Leonard Marsh had been friends since college. Fraternity brothers, 40 years of close contact according to what Frank had dug up, and for the last 6 of those years, according to Frank's notes, CARVELLO had been running a quiet, patient, extraordinarily well-hidden bribery operation out of an abandoned storage property on Route 9, locally known as the Shed, through which contracts for the county's infrastructure projects were being systematically steered toward a network of businesses CARVELLO controlled through shell companies. It was, in the way of all great bureaucratic corruption, almost magnificently boring on its surface. Roads, drainage systems, utility upgrades, the kind of public work spending that made citizens' eyes glaze over in town council meetings. And that was, Nora realized, precisely why it had worked for so long. Nobody was paying close enough attention. Nobody cared enough about stormwater remediation contracts to follow the money. Frank had cared. Why Frank had started looking? His notes didn't say. Or if they did, Nora couldn't find it in the page she had. There might be more, she realized. There might be a lot more. She thought about the ground next to his grave, about Duke's urgent, deliberate digging. She thought, he buried something there. Before he died, Frank Callahan had buried something right next to the plot, where he would eventually be laid to rest, either because he was afraid, or because he was running out of time, or because, and this thought hit her with a quiet, awful tenderness, he knew. On some level, Frank had known what was coming, and he had hidden his evidence in the one place he was certain Nora would eventually find it. Because she would come to the cemetery, and she would bring Duke, and Duke would know. She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes and breathed for a moment. Then she pulled out a notepad and started writing. Rule 1 in any serious investigation: do not act alone until you know who you can trust. She thought about the Harwick PD. Chief Haggerty had known Frank for 30 years. He was solid, she thought. Stubborn and old-fashioned and not always easy to work with, but honest. He was honest, but going to Haggerty meant going through official channels, which meant paperwork and meetings and procedure. And if CARVELLO had anyone inside the department, even just a friendly ear, someone who mentioned things casually at the wrong moment, the whole thread could disappear before she could pull it. She thought about the state police. She had a contact there, Sergeant Dara, a woman she'd trained alongside years ago, who now worked white-collar crime out of the Harrisburg field office. Dara was steady, careful, and crucially, she was completely outside Harwick's circle of influence. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. Not yet. Not until she had what was buried in that ground. She needed to go back to the cemetery. She needed to go at night, quietly, without drawing attention. And she needed to bring a shovel. That evening, Nora drove past the Route 9 storage property on her way back from the grocery store. She told herself it was just a drive, just a look. She slowed the car as she passed. The shed, if you could call it that, it was really more of a large corrugated metal outbuilding, sat about 50 yards back from the road behind a padlocked chain-link fence. The property looked abandoned. Weeds along the fence line, a rusted weather vane on the roof line, no lights. A single security camera mounted above the entrance that, from the outside, looked old and disused. But the padlock on the gate was not old. It was new. Bright steel, not a speck of rust. The kind you bought because you wanted it to work. Nora kept driving. In the passenger seat, Duke lifted his head and looked back over his shoulder at the shed as they passed it, his nostrils flaring, not natural, not accidental. Later, she went through the rest of the box from the closet more carefully, item by item. Frank's notebooks. 3 of them turned out to contain much less about his daily life than she'd hoped, and much more about his investigation. The notes went back 14 months. 14 months of careful, quiet, patient work. Names, dates, contract numbers cross-referenced with public records, meeting locations, vehicle descriptions. The slow, methodical picture of a man who had learned something deeply wrong was happening in the place he loved, and had set about building the case to prove it the only way he knew how. Fact by fact, piece by piece, one numbered page at a time. He'd done it alone. He hadn't told anyone. And 61 days before he died, he'd written a single sentence at the bottom of one notebook page that Nora read 3 times, very slowly, her finger tracing each word. "Marsh knows I've been asking around. Need to be careful." Below that, in different ink, as if written later, "VC called the house today. First time. Said he heard I was doing some independent research, and he'd love to buy me a coffee and hear about it." Smiling while he said it. They all smile. Nora closed the notebook. Sat very still. Duke padded over from his bed and laid his chin on her knee. She put her hand on his broad, warm head. "You knew," she said softly. "Didn't you, boy? You've known this whole time." Duke's amber eyes looked up at her. He didn't blink. She went to the cemetery at 11:15 on a Thursday night. She parked 2 blocks away on a side street behind the old Methodist church and walked with Duke on a short leash and a small flashlight whose beam she kept low and close to the ground. The cemetery gate was locked at dusk, but the lock was old and she had had a copy of the groundskeeper's key since Frank's funeral. An oversight on the department's part, or perhaps a quiet kindness. She'd never asked. The oaks along the flagstone path made soft sounds in the wind. Her boots on the frozen path were louder than she wanted. She moved slowly, stopping every few yards to listen, scanning the shadows between the rows of headstones. Nothing moved. At her father's grave, she knelt in the frost and ran her hand along the ground beside the headstone. Duke sat immediately to her left, watching the perimeter with a discipline that age had not diminished. She found the disturbed patch easily. Duke's digging earlier that morning had broken the frost and softened the surface. She pressed both hands down and felt it again. That slight, telling give. She started digging. The frozen crust gave way after the first few inches. The earth beneath was packed but workable. She went carefully, angling away from the grave itself, following the line of Duke's original excavation. She'd brought a trowel rather than a full shovel. More control, less noise. At approximately 9 inches down, the trowel scraped something solid. Not a stone. The sound was different, hollow, flat. She swept the dirt aside with her gloved hand. A metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, sealed with a strip of weatherproof tape around the lid. The outside was marked in black permanent marker NC ports, L's only. Nora Callahan. Only. Her throat tightened so sharply it almost hurt. She sat there in the dark with the cold from the ground seeping up through her knees, holding a box her dead father had buried for her, and she breathed very deliberately through her nose for 10 full seconds. Then she put it in her bag, filled the hole back in as best she could, patted the earth down, and looked at Frank's headstone for a long moment. "I've got it, Dad," she said quietly. "I've got it." Duke made a single sound, low, brief, something between a sigh and an acknowledgement, and pressed his head briefly against her hip. They walked back to the car in silence. The box contained 3 things. A USB drive, sealed in a small plastic evidence bag. A folded set of documents. Photocopies of county contract records and financial transfer receipts, annotated in Frank's handwriting, marked in yellow and red. And a letter, handwritten on the departmental letterhead Frank had kept from his last day of service. Dated 3 weeks before his death. Nora read it at the kitchen table with Duke lying at her feet and both hands flat on the surface beside the letter, as if she needed to anchor herself to something solid. It began, "Nora, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. Not for leaving things this way. I didn't want to. But I think you're going to understand why I had to." She read every word. She read it twice. By the time she finished, there were no tears left. Something harder had moved in to replace them. Something focused and cold and very, very quiet. She knew what had happened to her father. She knew who was responsible. And she knew exactly what she was going to do about it. The letter told her everything Frank had pieced together in his final months, and one critical detail he had only confirmed in his last few days. Victor CARVELLO had not just been running a bribery operation. According to what Frank had painstakingly documented, the infrastructure contracts were a secondary layer, the visible machinery of a much larger apparatus that involved funneling county construction funds through a series of shell entities into private, investment accounts connected to a small network of individuals that included, at its center, two names, CARVELLO and a man named Roy Bassett, a state-level government auditor who had been responsible for overseeing exactly the kind of county spending CARVELLO was manipulating. Bassett was the man who was supposed to catch it. Bassett was the man who was helping it happen. And Dr. Leonard Marsh, coroner, fraternity brother, loyal friend, was the insurance policy. If anything happened to anyone who got too close, Leonard could adjust the narrative. Leonard could determine cause of death. Leonard could make a cardiac event appear where none had naturally occurred. Frank's letter was explicit. He believed Dr. Marsh had the means and knowledge to administer a compound that would trigger cardiac arrest in a healthy adult without leaving markers that a standard autopsy would detect. He'd found a research paper referenced in an email he'd intercepted through a contact at the county records office, and that reference had led him to a pharmacological study on a class of potassium channel blocking agents that could induce sudden cardiac failure and metabolize almost entirely within hours. He'd attached the relevant pages from the study in the box. He had not been able to prove it. Not yet. He believed they knew he was close. He believed his phone was being monitored. He believed that the call from CARVELLO, the cheerful, threatening invitation for coffee, had been a message, not a request. He had buried the box rather than leave the evidence in the house because he was certain they would search the house if anything happened to him. And he had not gone to the police or the state authorities because he did not yet know who else might be connected. He was waiting, building, making sure the case was unassailable before he brought it to someone he could trust. He ran out of time. The last paragraph of the letter. There is one thing I am sure of. Duke will take you where you need to go. He knows. He's always known. Trust him, Nora. He's been trying to tell us something for weeks and I've been too stubborn to figure out what. I should have listened sooner. I think you'll do better than I did. You always were better at listening. Love, Dad. Nora folded the letter carefully and sat with it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. She called Dara. It rang 4 times. Then, Callahan? It's almost 1 in the morning. I know, Nora said. Dara, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not repeat anything I'm about to tell you to anyone else until we've talked. Can you do that? A brief pause. Talk to me. Nora talked for 40 minutes. At the end of it, Dara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Okay, I need you to scan everything in that box and send it to a secure channel I'm going to text you right now. Don't send it from your normal email. Use a new account, a device they haven't touched. Don't go near that shed. Don't approach Marsh or CARVELLO. Don't talk to anyone at your department until we've had a chance to assess the exposure. I understand, Nora said. And Nora. Dara's voice shifted. Warmer, lower. Your dad was meticulous. What you're describing, if the documentation supports it, this is significant. This is genuinely significant. I know. He was a good cop. Yes, Nora said. He was. She looked down at Duke, who was watching her steadily from the kitchen floor. He had good partners, she added. The next 11 days moved fast. Sergeant Dara O'Shea worked quickly and quietly. The financial documents Frank had collected gave the state investigators enough to begin pulling threads from their end. County contract records, wire transfer logs, incorporation filings. What they found corroborated Frank's notes almost precisely, and in several places went further. The shell company network was larger than Frank had known. The amount of money that had moved through it over 6 years was in excess of $4 million. And then a forensic accountant noticed something in Roy Bassett's private investment records. A payment, made 11 days before Frank Callahan died, from an account connected to CARVELLO to an account connected to Bassett. $40,000. No corresponding invoice, no legitimate transaction record, nothing. Just $40,000, moving quietly in the dark. 11 days before a healthy retired police officer sat down in his kitchen and died of a sudden cardiac event that his daughter had never entirely believed. On the 14th day, the state investigators moved. Nora was not there when they arrested CARVELLO. She was at home, on Dara's very firm instruction, waiting. She sat on her front porch with Duke beside her and listened to the wind in the oaks and waited for her phone to ring. When it rang, Dara's voice was steady and calm. "We have them. CARVELLO, Bassett, and MARSH. All three. The DA's office in Harrisburg is handling charges. Nora, Marsh gave a partial statement. He confirmed the compound. He confirmed it was used on your father." The world went very quiet. "They're ordering a secondary autopsy," Dara continued, "with specific panels for the class of compound Frank identified. It's going to take a few weeks. But Nora, the statement corroborates everything. Everything in your father's notes." Nora's jaw tightened. Her hand found the top of Duke's head. "He was murdered," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," said Dara softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Dara said he built the whole case himself, from nothing, alone in the last months of his life. The forensic accountant said she'd seen federal investigators with full teams take longer to put together what Frank Callahan did by himself. She said it like she was, "I don't know. Hard, a little." Nora let out a long, slow breath. "He was a good cop," she said, for the second time. "The best," said Dara. After she hung up, Nora sat on the porch for a long time. The November light was thin and pale, the sky the color of old pewter, the oaks along the street dropping their last leaves in slow, lazy spirals. Duke was pressed against her side, warm and solid and steady, and she kept her hand on him because it helped. Not just the warmth of him, the presence of him. The fact that he had known, from the beginning. From the first morning he had slipped his collar and walked to that hill in the grey pre-dawn light, and sat at Frank's grave and refused to leave. Duke had known. He had carried that knowledge in his extraordinary nose, his trained and faithful instincts, every alert nerve of a body built for exactly this kind of truth-finding. He had tried to tell her. He had been patient. He had kept coming back to the grave every single morning until she was ready to listen, and the moment she had given him the word, the old word, the one Frank had taught her on Saturday mornings when she was 8 years old, he had led her straight to it. Nora pressed her face briefly into the thick fur at the back of his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Duke." Duke made no sound, but his tail moved, once, slow and deliberate, against the porch boards. The legal process was long. It always was. Victor CARVELLO pled not guilty and hired 2 defense attorneys from Philadelphia whose hourly rate could have funded the Harwick PD's tech budget for a year. Roy Bassett, faced with the mounting evidence, negotiated a cooperation agreement with the state. Dr. Did. Leonard Marsh, who had, in the end, been the one to carry out the actual act, was charged with first-degree murder and faced trial without any deal on the table. The secondary autopsy confirmed what Frank's notes had theorized. Trace evidence of a synthetic potassium channel blocking compound was detected in preserved tissue samples, present in concentrations consistent with deliberate administration. The state medical examiner's report was 38 pages long and it used careful, precise scientific language throughout. But what it amounted to, what it plainly and unambiguously said, was this: Francis T. Callahan did not die of a heart attack. He was killed. The results were made public on a grey December morning, and Nora sat in her car in the parking lot of the Harwood PD and read the summary document on her phone and did not cry. She had already done that. Alone at home at 2 in the morning, with Duke sleeping against her feet and the house very quiet around her, she had let herself feel the full weight of it, the grief and the rage and the terrible, pointless waste of a good man's last months, spent alone and frightened and trying to do the right thing right up until it killed him. She had felt all of it. And then she had gotten up and made coffee and kept going. Because that was what Frank would have done. That was what Frank had taught her, from as far back as she could remember. Not in words, exactly, but in the steady, daily example of who he was. You kept going. You didn't quit, not when things were hard. Not when the right thing cost you something. Not when it would be so much easier to look the other way and let the comfortable lie stand. He had not quit, and neither would she. In March, Nora testified before the state grand jury. She was on the stand for 4 hours and she answered every question plainly and fully and without hesitation. When the prosecutor asked her how the investigation had begun, What had first made her suspect her father's death might be something other than what it appeared. She paused for a moment, and the courtroom was very quiet. "My father's canine partner," she said. "Duke." He kept going back to the grave. Every morning before dawn he would go and sit by the headstone, and then one morning he started digging beside it. She looked at the prosecutor. "He was trying to show me where my father had hidden the evidence. He'd been trained to find things that mattered, and my father was the one who trained him. I think he knew. I think Duke understood that Frank had left something there, and he was waiting for me to be ready to look." The courtroom was silent. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed. The prosecutor wrote something on his notepad. "How long?" he asked carefully. "Do you think the dog had been trying to tell you?" Nora thought about the first morning she'd walked past the cemetery and found Duke sitting at the grave. The way he'd looked at her, patient, certain. "Since the day after the funeral," she said. 8 months. She paused. He just kept waiting until I was ready to hear it. Victor CARVELLO was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy and sentenced to 19 years in a federal correctional facility. Roy Bassett received a reduced sentence of 6 years in exchange for his full cooperation in testimony. Dr. Leonard Marsh was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. At sentencing, Marsh said nothing. He sat in his chair and looked at his hands and said absolutely nothing. And the judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Cross, read the sentence in a voice that did not waver. Nora was not in the courtroom for that. She was at the cemetery. She sat on the bench near the eastern fence. Someone had placed one there sometime in the past month, and she didn't know who and had decided not to investigate it. With Duke beside her, watching the late afternoon light move across the headstones. The oaks were bare now, their branches making their patient winter shapes against the sky. A thin layer of snow had come through the night before and lay across the grave markers in quiet white drifts. She had put fresh flowers on Frank's grave that morning. Yellow ones. He'd always said yellow was an underrated color. Duke lay with his head on her knee, breathing slow and deep, watching the cemetery with the calm authority of something that understood exactly where it was and why it was there. "We got them, Dad," Nora said. The oaks moved in the wind. Somewhere near the back of the cemetery, a crow settled on a fence post and was still. Duke's tail moved once. In the spring, Nora Callahan was offered a position with the State Police Criminal Investigation Unit in Harrisburg. Sergeant Dara had recommended her. The offer came with a significant pay increase, a broader scope of work, and a transfer out of Harwick. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She said no. Harwick was her town. It was Frank's town. It still had 3 stoplights and 1 diner and 9,000 people who were, most of them, just trying to live their lives honestly. And it still needed someone in that detective's office who knew where the pressure points were and cared enough to push back. She stayed. She requested an upgrade to the department's canine program, better equipment, better training protocols, better partnership with the county vet for working and retired dogs alike. Chief Haggerty approved everything. And every Sunday morning before her shift, she took Duke to the cemetery. He didn't dig anymore. He didn't need to. He would sit in front of Frank's headstone for 10 or 15 minutes, very still, very calm. And Nora would sit beside him on the bench and drink her coffee from a thermos and watch the light change across the hill. And there was something in those mornings that felt like peace. Not the absence of grief. She thought grief for someone you loved was not something you ever entirely put down, and she didn't think you were supposed to. But a different thing. Something that sat alongside the grief without fighting it. A quiet, earned stillness. "He never quit," the headstone said. Neither did she. Neither did Duke. Some truths are buried, not to be hidden forever, but to be found when the right person is finally ready to look. Loyalty doesn't stop at death. It endures in the ones left behind, the ones who keep returning, morning after morning, in the cold and the dark, refusing to let go of what mattered. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is exactly what Frank Callahan taught his daughter in a training field on a Saturday morning when she was 8 years old. Be still, pay attention, and trust the dog.